He didn't even look at her when he said it. Just a cold sentence in a language no one else at the table understood, a quiet challenge wrapped in arrogance. And for a moment, it worked, because Clara Bennett kept walking, tray steady, eyes lowered. Just another invisible waitress in a room full of people who never noticed the ones who served them. But something in that sentence lingered in the air, sharp, misplaced, wrong in a way only someone listening closely would catch, and Clara heard it. Every syllable, every subtle shift in tone, the kind of detail most people would miss, the kind that could turn a multi-million-dollar deal into a silent disaster. And still, she said nothing, not at first, because she had learned long ago that speaking at the wrong time cost more than staying quiet. Especially when the man at the center of it all was Alexander Hayes, a CEO known for precision, control, and a quiet kind of dominance that filled every room he entered without him ever raising his voice. He sat there in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Clara made in a month, casually swirling his glass, completely certain of his position, completely unaware that the investor across from him had just misrepresented a critical clause, and that the sentence spoken moments ago in Icelandic, meant to impress, meant to exclude, was about to lead them straight into a mistake, the kind that doesn't show up immediately, the kind that waits until contracts are signed and reputations are on the line. Clara paused near the edge of the table, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray, her mind already translating, already calculating, already weighing whether this was her place. Because people like her weren't supposed to interrupt, weren't supposed to correct, weren't supposed to exist beyond the edges of conversations that shaped fortunes. But the room felt different now, heavier, like something invisible had shifted. And then the investor repeated the phrase again, slower this time, confident, reinforcing the same mistake. And Clara exhaled softly, almost inaudibly, before stepping forward, her voice calm, steady, precise as she spoke in flawless Icelandic, correcting the sentence with a clarity that cut through the table like glass. And everything stopped, the quiet kind of silence that doesn't need to be announced. Forks paused, eyes lifted, and for the first time that evening, Alexander Hayes looked up, really looked. His expression changing just enough to reveal something unfamiliar, not anger, not annoyance, but recognition, because this wasn't part of his world, this wasn't expected, and Clara didn't rush, didn't apologize, didn't shrink back. She simply finished the correction, her tone respectful but firm, explaining the nuance, the implication hidden beneath the words, and the investor's face shifted, confusion giving way to realization, followed by a slow nod, because she was right, undeniably right. And just like that, the direction of the conversation changed, subtly but completely, and Alexander leaned back slightly, studying her now, not as a waitress, not as background noise, but as something else entirely, something he hadn't accounted for. And when he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, edged with something new. He asked a simple question, one he wasn't used to asking. Where did you learn that? And Clara met his gaze for just a second, her eyes steady, unreadable, before offering the smallest hint of a smile and saying, somewhere you stopped listening. Then she turned, just another step, just another movement. But this time, the silence she left behind was louder than anything that had been said. The sound of her footsteps faded into the background, but the silence she left behind stayed at the table, heavier than before, and Alexander Hayes did not reach for his glass this time. He did not check his phone. He did not continue the conversation as if nothing had happened, because something had happened, something small and precise that had shifted the balance in a way he could not immediately define. And the investors felt it too, their posture slightly adjusted, their confidence recalibrating around the unexpected correction that had just saved them from an invisible mistake, the kind that does not announce itself until it is too late. And one of them cleared his throat, attempting to recover the rhythm of the discussion, but his words came out slower now, more careful, because the illusion of control had cracked, just enough to let doubt in, and Alexander leaned forward, his fingers resting lightly on the table, his gaze no longer drifting but focused. Intentional, he asked a follow-up question, this time in English, but with a precision that suggested he was now listening for what might be hidden beneath the surface, and the investor responded, cautiously, adjusting his earlier statement. But Alexander already knew something was off, not because of the words, but because of her reaction. The way Clara had paused, the way she had chosen the exact moment to speak. Not too early, not too late. And that timing was not accidental. It was trained, refined, the mark of someone who understood more than language, someone who understood consequence. And across the room, Clara moved between tables with the same quiet rhythm as before, refilling water, clearing plates, her expression neutral, almost detached, as if nothing unusual had taken place. But her awareness remained sharp, tracking the conversation without looking, hearing the subtle shifts in tone, the hesitation that had not been there before. And when she returned to the table to place a fresh glass beside Alexander, she did not meet his eyes. She simply set it down with steady hands. But he spoke before she could step away, his voice low, controlled. You corrected a contractual implication, not just a translation. And this time, the table went quiet again, not because of surprise, but because of attention, and Clara paused, just for a second, enough to acknowledge the question without fully accepting it. Sometimes words carry more than they say. She replied softly, her tone measured, and one of the investors let out a small breath, almost a laugh, trying to ease the tension. Well, that was fortunate timing, he said, but Alexander did not look at him. His focus remained on Clara, studying the space between what she said and what she did not. Because fortunate timing was not what he saw intention, and intention meant history, and history meant there was something here that did not belong in a place like this, not in a uniform like that, not in a role that required silence. And Clara felt the weight of that attention, not uncomfortable, not afraid, but aware, the way someone feels when they have stepped just slightly outside the boundaries they have carefully maintained. And for a moment, there was a choice again, to retreat, to let the moment pass, to disappear back into the rhythm of service. But instead, she gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, and said, You were about to agree to a term that limits your leverage. After 6 months, and the words landed quietly, but their impact spread immediately. One investor straightened, another frowned, and Alexander's expression sharpened, not in anger, but in recognition, because now he saw it clearly. The mistake, the oversight, the gap that had been hidden behind confident language and polished delivery. And he leaned back slowly, his mind already recalculating, already restructuring the deal in real time. And for the first time in years, the outcome of the room was not entirely under his control. It had been influenced, redirected, by someone he had dismissed without a second thought. And as Clara turned to leave once more, he spoke again, not louder, but with a weight that carried across the table. You said I stopped listening. And she paused, just at the edge of the light, her profile calm. Composed. Yes, she answered simply. And he held her there with a question that was no longer casual, no longer rhetorical. When? And this time, she did look at him. Not long, not intensely, just enough for him to see something real behind the quiet, something that did not belong to this room. 3 years ago, she said. And then she walked away, leaving him with a number that meant nothing to anyone else at the table, but everything to him. 3 years ago does not mean anything to me, one of the investors said with a nervous laugh, trying to pull the conversation back into familiar territory. But Alexander Hayes did not respond. He did not even acknowledge the interruption, because his mind had already moved somewhere else, somewhere precise, structured, pulling threads from memory with the same discipline he used to build empires. And for a moment, the restaurant faded, the voices blurred, and all that remained was a number. 3 years, and a deal that had slipped through his control in a way that had never fully made sense. A negotiation in Reykjavik, quiet, complex, almost perfect until it was not. Until a single clause had shifted the outcome in favor of the other side, costing him leverage he had not realized he was losing until it was already done. And he had reviewed that deal dozens of times, line by line, searching for the exact point where control had slipped, but he had never found it. Not clearly, not definitively, and now, standing in a restaurant thousands of miles away, a waitress had just pointed to it without hesitation, without notes, without access, and that was not coincidence. That was knowledge, and knowledge like that did not come from observation alone. It came from presence, and Alexander's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled movement that signaled a shift in his focus. Continue. he said calmly to the investors, his voice steady, but his attention divided. Part of him still following the conversation, correcting details, steering the deal back into alignment, while the other part traced backward through time, reconstructing a room he had not thought about in years, the long table, the cold light, the translator sitting quietly at the edge, someone he had barely noticed, someone who had spoken only when necessary, precise, efficient, invisible, and suddenly that memory sharpened, not fully formed, but enough to recognize a pattern, the same stillness, the same timing, the same restraint, and across the room, Clara Bennett placed a check on another table, her movements unchanged, her expression composed. But inside, she felt the shift, not in the room, but in him, the moment when observation turns into recognition, when a person stops seeing a role and starts seeing a pattern. And that was the moment she had always avoided. Because recognition changes things, it creates questions, it invites attention, and attention has a cost. And she had spent 3 years ensuring that cost would not find her again. But some patterns do not stay hidden forever, and when she returned to the service station, another waitress leaned in slightly, whispering, "What did you say to that table?" They all went quiet, and Clara offered a small, almost dismissive smile. "Just clarified an order," she said, her voice even, and the other woman laughed softly, accepting the answer because it fit the surface of what she saw. But Clara knew better, and so did Alexander, because now he was watching, not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the quiet intensity of someone assembling a truth piece by piece. And when the meeting finally reached a pause, when signatures were not yet on paper but the direction was set, he stood, adjusting his jacket with a calm that masked the precision behind it. And instead of leaving, instead of moving on to the next obligation waiting on his calendar, he stepped away from the table, his path deliberate, measured, until he reached the edge of the service area where Clara stood, organizing receipts. And for a moment, he said nothing, because this was no longer a casual question, no longer a passing curiosity. This was something else, something that required accuracy. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of assumption. "You were in Reykjavik," he said, not asking, not accusing, simply stating, and Clara did not look surprised. She did not react at all in the way most people would when confronted with a hidden past. She just lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze with the same calm that had unsettled him from the beginning. And in that quiet space between them, where status and roles no longer defined the interaction, she answered with a single word that confirmed everything and explained nothing at the same time. "Yes." And the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could, because now the question was no longer what she knew, but why she was here, and that was a question Alexander Hayes was not used to not having the answer to. Alexander Hayes held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, not out of dominance this time, but because something did not align, not in the way he understood people, because people with that level of precision, that level of awareness, did not step away from rooms where decisions shaped markets. They did not trade strategy for silence. And yet Clara Bennett stood there in a simple uniform, a pen in her hand, receipts stacked neatly in front of her, as if that was the entirety of her world, and the contrast was too exact to ignore. "You were the translator," he said quietly, not asking anymore, connecting the final piece. And Clara did not deny it, but she did not confirm it directly either. She simply adjusted the stack of receipts, aligning the edges with careful attention, a small action that bought her a second of time, a second to decide how much to say. Because truth, when given without control, can take more than it offers. "I was present," she replied, her voice even, and the choice of words was deliberate, enough to acknowledge, not enough to reveal, and Alexander recognized that immediately. The restraint, the discipline, the refusal to step into a narrative he could control, and for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Not frustration, but distance, the realization that he was not leading this conversation, that he was following it, step by step, through spaces she allowed, and that was not a position he occupied often. "You corrected something no one else caught," he continued, his tone measured, but now there was something beneath it, not ego, but curiosity sharpened by respect. "That clause cost me a negotiation," and Clara's expression did not change, but her eyes softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with recognition, because she remembered that room, the tension beneath the surface. The moment when words shifted meaning without anyone acknowledging it, except her, and she had said nothing then, just as she had almost said nothing now, and that was not a coincidence. That was a pattern she had chosen. It was not the clause, she said quietly, and Alexander stilled, because the certainty in her voice carried weight. It was the timing, she added, lifting her eyes to meet his again, and in that brief exchange, something clicked, something deeper than language, because she was not correcting his memory, she was reframing it, and that required a level of understanding that went beyond translation, beyond observation, into something strategic, something he recognized in himself, and that recognition shifted the ground between them, not into conflict, but into alignment, and for a moment, the noise of the restaurant returned, the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversations, the rhythm of a world continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Alexander, something had, because now he was no longer looking at a question, he was looking at an answer he did not yet understand. "Why are you here?" he asked finally, not with disbelief, but with genuine inquiry, and Clara exhaled softly, not tired, not hesitant, just aware that this was the question that always came next, the one that carried assumptions, expectations, solutions he would be ready to offer before she finished speaking, and she had seen that before, many times, in many forms, and she had learned that the answer mattered less than the control of it. So she did not explain, she did not justify, she simply glanced past him for a second, toward the table where his investors waited, slightly uncertain now, watching the interaction they could not fully hear, and then she returned her gaze to him, steady, grounded. "Because this is where I choose to be," she said, and the simplicity of it created a pause, not because it was incomplete, but because it left no space for negotiation, no opening for correction, and Alexander felt that clearly. The boundary drawn not with force, but with certainty, and for the first time in the conversation, he did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to adjust, nothing to counter, only a truth he could not reshape. And as Clara stepped past him, returning to her work with the same quiet rhythm as before, he remained still for a second longer, not out of hesitation, but because something within him had shifted from control to consideration, and when he finally turned back toward his table, the deal waiting, the expectations unchanged, he carried with him a question that no longer felt like a puzzle to solve, but a perspective he had overlooked, and that realization stayed with him longer than the conversation itself. The meeting resumed, but it did not return to what it had been, because something subtle had shifted in the way Alexander Hayes listened, not just to the words being spoken, but to the spaces between them, the pauses, the assumptions, the quiet confidence that often masked incomplete understanding, and now, each sentence was measured differently, not accepted at face value, not dismissed based on tone, but examined with a precision that had been missing, and the investors noticed it. Not directly, not in a way they could name, but in the way he interrupted less and questioned more, in the way he let silence stretch just a second longer before responding, as if he was waiting for something deeper to surface. And when one of them restated the adjusted terms, attempting to move forward with renewed confidence, Alexander nodded once, slowly, then leaned forward, his voice calm but exact. "Clarify the 6-month limitation again," he said, and the investor hesitated, just slightly, because that was the same detail that had nearly gone unnoticed before, and now it carried weight. And across the room, Clara Bennett heard it, not because she was trying to listen, but because once you have heard something clearly, you cannot unhear it, and she continued her work, moving between tables. But her awareness remained aligned with that conversation, not out of obligation, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had shaped her choices long before this moment. And when she passed by again, she did not slow down, she did not look at the table, but she heard the correction, this time accurate, this time intentional, and for a brief second, her expression softened, not visibly to anyone watching, but enough to register the shift, the quiet satisfaction of something set right without needing recognition, and Alexander caught that, not the expression itself, but the timing of it, the way she moved past just as the conversation corrected itself, as if she had anticipated the adjustment before it happened, and that reinforced what he already understood, that her presence in that room was not incidental, it was precise, controlled, chosen. And when the meeting finally concluded, when agreements were outlined and next steps established, the investors stood, shaking hands, their confidence restored, unaware of how close they had come to a different outcome, and Alexander remained composed, professional, exactly as expected, but his attention did not follow them as they left. It returned to the same place it had been drawn to from the moment she spoke, and when the table cleared, when the noise of the meeting dissolved into the general rhythm of the restaurant, he did not leave immediately. He stayed seated, watching the space as if it might reveal something he had missed, and after a moment, he stood, not with urgency, but with intention, moving through the room until he reached the service station again, where Clara was organizing the final receipts of the evening, her movements steady, consistent, untouched by the weight of what had just unfolded, and he stopped a few feet away this time, not stepping into her space, not interrupting her rhythm, but present enough to be acknowledged. And when she looked up, it was not with surprise, but with the quiet awareness of someone who had expected this, not because of who he was, but because of what had happened. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because the question had already been asked, the answer already given, and what remained was not curiosity, but decision, and Alexander broke the silence first, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge it carried before. "You chose to stay invisible," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation, and Clara considered that for a second, not rejecting it, not accepting it entirely, but weighing it. "I chose to be where I am not underestimated by myself," she replied, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, because they did not challenge him, they reframed the entire premise, and for the first time, Alexander did not try to respond immediately, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to improve, only something to understand. And as the moment held, just long enough to matter, he reached into his jacket, not with the casual confidence of someone offering an opportunity, but with the measured intent of someone acknowledging value. And he placed a simple business card on the counter, not pushing it toward her, not insisting, just leaving it there. "If you ever decide to choose differently," he said. And then he stopped, not finishing the sentence. Because for once, he understood that not every offer needs to be completed to be understood, and Clara glanced at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and she did not pick it up, not immediately, not while he was still standing there, and Alexander gave a small nod, not of agreement, not of expectation, but of recognition, and then he turned, walking toward the exit with the same composed stride he had entered with. But this time, something followed him out. That had not been there before, not doubt, not regret, but awareness, and behind him, the restaurant continued as it always had, quiet, steady, ordinary, except for the small card resting on the counter, waiting, not as an invitation, but as a question Clara Bennett had not yet decided to answer. The restaurant grew quieter as the night moved forward, not in silence, but in rhythm, the steady kind that settles after something unexpected has passed, and Clara Bennett remained where she always was, between tables, between conversations, between moments that mattered to others more than they ever seemed to matter to her. But the small white card resting on the counter had changed the space around it, not visibly, not to anyone else, but to her, because it was not just a piece of paper, it was a shift, a line drawn between two paths she had spent 3 years keeping separate, and she did not touch it at first. She let it sit there as she continued her work, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving with the same quiet precision that had defined her presence long before Alexander Hayes walked into that room. But her awareness circled back to it again and again, not out of temptation, but out of recognition, because she understood exactly what it represented, not opportunity, not in the way most people would see it, but attention, and attention always came with expectation. And expectation had a way of rewriting choices if you were not careful, and when the last table finished, when the final check was signed and the chairs were slowly pushed back into place, the restaurant began to close, lights dimming slightly, voices lowering, the kind of transition that signaled the end of one day and the quiet beginning of another, and Clara returned to the service station one last time. Standing in front of the counter where the card still rested, untouched, exactly where he had left it, And for a moment, she simply looked at it, not reaching, not hesitating, just observing, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than action. And behind her, one of the staff members called out, joking lightly, asking if she was finally going to take the mysterious offer, and Clara allowed a small smile, the kind that did not confirm anything, the kind that let the question exist without needing an answer. "It is just a card," she said quietly, but her voice carried a weight that suggested otherwise, because she knew better. She always had. And as the others moved on, distracted by their own conversations, their own plans for the night, Clara reached forward, finally, her fingers brushing against the edge of the card. Not picking it up immediately, just making contact, grounding the moment in something real. And in that small gesture, a memory surfaced, not sharply, not painfully, but clearly, the same kind of room, the same kind of table, the same kind of attention, and the way it had shifted everything that followed, not because of what was said, but because of what was assumed afterward. And she closed her eyes for a brief second, not to escape it, but to acknowledge it, to remind herself why she had stepped away, why she had chosen distance over recognition, control over visibility. And when she opened them again, the restaurant was empty, the lights softer now, the reflections in the glass quieter, and the card was still there, unchanged, offering nothing new. Only the same question it had carried from the beginning, and this time, Clara picked it up, not quickly, not impulsively, but with the same calm intention that defined everything she did, turning it over once in her hand, reading the name without surprise, because she already knew it, already understood the weight behind it. And for a moment, she considered what would happen if she stepped back into that world, not the surface version of it, not the polished conversations and controlled outcomes, but the deeper structure beneath it, the constant negotiation, the expectation to respond, to engage, to be seen. And she exhaled softly, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply holding it in balance. And then, without urgency, she slipped the card into the pocket of her apron, not as a decision, not as a commitment, but as a possibility she was not ready to define. And as she turned off the final light and stepped out into the cool night air, the city moving around her in its own steady rhythm, Clara Bennett walked forward without looking back. But this time, there was something different in the way she carried herself. Not a change in direction, not yet, but a shift in awareness, because for the first time in a long time, the path ahead was no longer fixed. It was open, and somewhere across the city, in an office where the lights never turned off completely, Alexander Hayes stood by a window, looking out without seeing the skyline, because his mind was still in that room, still in that moment, still on the quiet certainty of someone who had chosen to step away from everything he had spent years building toward. And for the first time, he did not reach for a solution. He did not assign someone to find answers. He simply stood there, allowing the question to exist, knowing that some things were not meant to be uncovered by force, but revealed by time. And that understanding stayed with him, quiet but persistent, like a sentence he had not yet learned how to translate. The city moved the way it always did, indifferent, steady, filled with people chasing outcomes they believed they could control. And somewhere within that rhythm, two decisions began to unfold in silence, not announced, not forced, just quietly taking shape over time. And for Alexander Hayes, that decision did not begin in a boardroom or during a meeting. It began in the absence of one. In the unusual pause he allowed himself the next morning, standing at his office window long after his first call had ended. The skyline stretching out in front of him, unchanged, predictable, structured, everything he had built his world around. And yet something about it felt different, not because the city had shifted, but because his perspective had. And that shift traced back to a single moment, a single correction delivered without hesitation, without agenda, without the need to be acknowledged. And that absence of need was what stayed with him. Because in his world, everything came with intention, every action carried a purpose, a negotiation, a return. But Clara Bennett had asked for nothing, not recognition, not opportunity, not even validation. She had simply acted, and then stepped back, leaving the result to stand on its own. And that kind of detachment was not weakness, it was control of a different kind, one he had not fully understood until now. And across the city, Clara moved through her morning with the same quiet rhythm she had carried the night before, the card still resting in the pocket of her apron, not forgotten, not prioritized, simply present, like a thought she had not yet chosen to finish. And as she walked into the restaurant again, the familiar sounds greeted her, the low hum of preparation, the clink of dishes, the routine that grounded everything in something simple, something stable, and she stepped into it without hesitation, tying her apron, adjusting her sleeves, becoming once again the version of herself that required no explanation, no attention, no expectation beyond what was immediately in front of her. But the difference now was subtle, almost imperceptible, because while her actions remained the same, her awareness had shifted. The line she had drawn between worlds no longer felt as fixed as it once had. And as the day moved forward, customers came and went, conversations overlapped, orders were placed and delivered, and through it all, Clara remained consistent, steady, present, until the moment it was not, until the door opened and a familiar presence entered, not announced, not exaggerated, just there. And Alexander Hayes stepped inside with the same composed posture he always carried. But this time, there was no meeting waiting, no table reserved for negotiation, no audience expecting performance. Just a decision that had led him back to the same place, not out of necessity, but out of choice, and Clara noticed him immediately, not because she was looking, but because awareness like hers did not require effort. It simply registered what mattered. And for a brief second, their eyes met across the room, not with surprise, not with tension, but with recognition of something unfinished, and Alexander did not approach right away. He took a seat, alone this time, without the structure of business around him, without the layers that usually defined his interactions, and when Clara eventually walked over, her posture calm, her expression neutral, it was not as someone stepping into his world, but as someone holding her own, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the conversation they had started the night before had not ended. It had simply paused, and now, in the quiet space between what was expected and what was chosen, it waited to continue, not with urgency, not with pressure, but with a question that no longer belonged to one of them alone. "You came back without a meeting," Clara said quietly, her voice even as she set a glass of water in front of him, not as an observation meant to challenge, but as one that acknowledged something different in his presence. And Alexander Hayes allowed a small pause before responding, not because he did not have an answer, but because he was choosing which one mattered. "I came back without an agenda," he replied. And that was the first shift, not in words, but in tone, because there was no weight behind it, no expectation attached, just a statement that stood on its own. And Clara noticed that immediately, not the content, but the absence of pressure that usually followed someone like him. And she nodded slightly, not agreeing, not questioning, simply accepting the space he had created. And for a moment, the conversation did not move forward. It settled, like something being placed carefully rather than pushed, and around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, orders being called, plates being carried, conversations overlapping in soft layers. But at that table, there was a different kind of stillness, one that did not demand attention, yet held it anyway, and Alexander leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed in a way that did not diminish his presence, but reshaped it. "You said I stopped listening," he continued, his eyes steady, not searching for a flaw, but for clarity. "I have been thinking about that." And Clara allowed a small breath to pass, not surprised, because she had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize the pattern when someone shifted from reaction to reflection, and she rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself in the moment. "Most people do," she said softly, and he tilted his head just slightly, not in disagreement, but in curiosity, because that answer did not carry judgment, it carried experience, and that difference mattered. "At what point?" he asked. And this time, the question was not about him alone. It was broader, more open, and Clara considered it, not quickly, not casually, but with the same care she gave to everything she chose to say, because timing, as she had already shown him, changed meaning. "When the outcome becomes more important than the understanding," she replied, her voice calm, and the words settled into the space between them with quiet precision. And Alexander did not respond immediately, not because he disagreed, but because he recognized the truth in it, not as a general idea, but as something specific, something that traced back through decisions he had made, conversations he had controlled, outcomes he had secured, and the subtle shift that had happened along the way without him noticing. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed that realization to exist without trying to reshape it, and Clara watched that, not his expression, but the absence of immediate correction, the space he gave the thought to settle, and she understood that something had changed, not completely, not permanently, but enough to matter. And when she stepped back slightly, giving him space again, it was not to end the conversation, but to let it continue without forcing it. And Alexander followed that rhythm, not with words, but with presence, remaining where he was, not reaching for his phone, not checking the time, just allowing the moment to extend naturally. And after a few seconds, he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but clearer. "You walked away from something most people would not," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Clara's expression remained composed. But there was a slight shift in her eyes, not defensive, not distant, just aware. Because that statement carried assumptions she did not need to correct, and she responded with the same measured clarity. "Most people assume it was something to hold on to," she said, and that was the second shift, because now the conversation was no longer about what she had left, but about what it had been. And Alexander understood that immediately, the difference between value and perception, between what something offers and what it demands, and he nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because for the first time, he was not trying to define the situation, he was allowing it to define itself. And as Clara turned slightly, preparing to continue her work, she paused just long enough to add one more sentence, not as an explanation, but as a quiet conclusion. "Some things look like opportunity from the outside," she said, her voice steady, "until you understand the cost." And then she stepped away, leaving him with a thought that did not need to be answered immediately, because this time, he knew the difference between hearing it and understanding it would depend entirely on whether he was willing to listen long enough. Alexander Hayes remained seated long after Clara Bennett walked away, not out of hesitation, but because something in her last sentence refused to settle into a simple conclusion. It lingered, quiet but persistent, like a detail that did not fit into the structure he was used to relying on, and he did not reach for his phone this time. He did not fill the space with movement or distraction. He simply sat there, letting the words unfold in his mind without forcing them into immediate meaning. And that alone was unfamiliar, because in his world, delay was inefficiency, reflection was often replaced by decision, and yet now, he allowed the pause to exist, and in that pause, something began to shift. Not in the room, not in the conversation, but in the way he approached it, because for the first time, he was not trying to solve her, he was trying to understand what did not need to be solved. And across the restaurant, Clara moved with the same quiet rhythm, but her awareness remained connected to the table she had just left, not in anticipation, not in expectation, but in recognition of something that had not yet fully revealed itself. And when she passed by again, carrying a tray toward another table, she did not look at him, but she felt the difference, the absence of pressure, the absence of pursuit. And that told her more than any question could, because people who needed answers often asked them too quickly, and people who did not were the ones who stayed silent long enough to let something real surface. And Alexander was no longer asking quickly. He was waiting, and that changed the space between them in a way that did not need to be spoken. And when she returned to his table to clear the untouched glass, she paused for a moment, not out of obligation, but because the conversation had not ended, it had simply shifted into something quieter, something more precise, and Alexander looked up, not with expectation, but with a steadiness that matched her own, and for a second, neither of them spoke. Because the silence now carried meaning, not uncertainty, and he finally broke it, his voice lower than before, but clearer. "You did not take the card right away," he said, not as a question, but as an observation that acknowledged her control over the moment. And Clara allowed the smallest nod, her expression calm. "Timing matters," she replied. And there was no emphasis, no explanation, just the same principle she had demonstrated from the beginning. And Alexander leaned back slightly, considering that, because he understood timing in terms of strategy, of markets, of decisions that required precision. But this was different. This was timing as restraint, timing as choice. Timing is something that defined not just when you act, but why you act. And that distinction was not something he had focused on before, and he nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a concept he could not yet fully articulate. And then he asked, not quickly, not casually, but with intention, "What made you leave?" And this time, the question was not about opportunity, not about career, but about the point where understanding shifted into decision, and Clara did not respond immediately. Not because she was avoiding the answer, but because the question itself required precision, and after a moment, she placed the glass gently on the tray, her movement steady, grounding the moment before she spoke. "I did not leave," she said quietly, and Alexander's expression shifted slightly, not in confusion, but in recalibration, because that answer changed the direction entirely, and she continued, her voice even. "I stepped out of something that no longer required me to understand it." And the words settled into the space between them with quiet clarity, and Alexander felt that difference immediately, because leaving suggested loss, retreat, something incomplete, but stepping out suggested completion, a boundary reached and acknowledged, and that distinction reframed everything he had assumed. And for a moment, he did not respond. Not because he lacked words, but because the ones he had did not fit anymore, and Clara watched that, not his reaction, but the absence of immediate interpretation, and she recognized it as the same shift she had seen before, the moment when someone begins to listen beyond their own framework, and she stepped back slightly, giving the conversation space to continue without forcing it forward. And Alexander followed that rhythm again, not with another question, but with a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. And as Clara turned to move to the next table, she paused just long enough to add one more sentence. Not as explanation, not as defense, but as a simple truth. "Understanding something fully does not mean you have to stay in it," she said, and then she walked away, leaving him with a realization that did not demand action, only reflection. And this time, he did not try to follow it immediately, because he was beginning to understand that some answers only made sense if you allowed them to remain unanswered just a little longer. Alexander Hayes did not move immediately after Clara Bennett walked away, not because he was unsure of what to say next, but because for the first time in a long time, he understood that saying something too quickly would reduce what he had just heard into something smaller than it was, and he was no longer interested in reducing things for the sake of control, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present, like a shift in balance he had not noticed until it was already happening, and he finally stood, not with urgency, not with purpose tied to a schedule, but with a calm intention that felt different even to him. And as he walked toward the door, he did not look back this time, not because the moment had ended, but because it had moved beyond something that required immediate continuation. And outside, the air carried that same steady rhythm the city always held, cars passing, voices blending, life continuing without pause. And for a moment, Alexander simply stood there, not reaching for his phone, not stepping into the next obligation waiting for him, but allowing the quiet space between actions to exist. And that was where the realization became clearer, not fully formed, but enough to recognize its direction, because Clara had not just corrected a mistake, she had shifted the way he approached certainty itself. And that was not something he could measure or quantify. It was something he had to carry, and across the street, a reflection in the glass caught his attention, not his own, but the movement behind him, the restaurant still visible, still active, and for a brief second, he considered going back, continuing the conversation, asking the questions that had not yet been answered, but he did not move, because this time, he understood that some conversations lose their meaning when forced beyond their natural timing, and timing, as she had said, mattered. And inside, Clara continued her work, the rhythm unchanged, the motion steady, but her awareness shifted again, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not been said, the absence of pursuit, the absence of insistence, and that told her more than anything else could. Because she had learned to recognize when someone was trying to take control of a situation, and when someone was choosing to step back from it. And Alexander had stepped back, not out of disinterest, but out of understanding, and that distinction mattered more than any offer he could have made. And when she reached into her apron pocket for a pen, her fingers brushed against the card again. A small reminder of the choice still resting between possibility and decision, and this time, she did not ignore it. She pulled it out, turning it over once more, not searching for something new, but confirming what had already been there from the beginning: the name, the number, the access to a world she had stepped away from. And she held it there for a moment, not with hesitation, but with clarity. Because now the decision was not about whether she could return, it was about whether she needed to, and that difference changed everything. And as the day moved forward, as customers came and went, as conversations layered over one another in the familiar pattern of routine, Clara allowed the question to remain open, not unanswered, but not finalized, because she understood something most people did not: that decisions made too quickly often belong to expectations, not to truth. And somewhere across the city, Alexander stepped into his office again, the structure of his world waiting exactly as he had left it, schedules aligned, meetings prepared, outcomes anticipated. But this time, he moved through it differently, not dramatically, not in a way others would immediately notice, but in the way he paused before responding, in the way he allowed a second of silence before speaking, in the way he listened for what was not being said. And that change, subtle as it was, began to shape everything that followed, because understanding, once expanded, does not return to its previous limits. And as the day approached its midpoint, as decisions were made and conversations concluded, one thought remained steady beneath it all: not urgent, not distracting, but persistent, the quiet recognition that some of the most important shifts do not come from what you gain, but from what you are finally willing to see. And that awareness stayed with him, just as the card remained with her, both of them holding something that had not yet fully revealed what it would become, but had already changed the direction of what came next. The day did not announce its turning point. It arrived quietly, in the space between routine and awareness, and Clara Bennett felt it not as a sudden realization, but as a steady clarity that had been building since the moment she slipped the card into her pocket. And now, as she stood near the window during a brief pause in the afternoon shift, the light falling softly across the polished surface of the table, she held the card again, not with uncertainty, but with a kind of stillness that comes when a decision is no longer forming, but waiting to be acknowledged. And around her, the restaurant continued its usual rhythm, conversations rising and falling, plates moving, the familiar choreography of service that had once been enough to define the boundaries of her world. But those boundaries had shifted, not because something external had forced them, but because something internal had opened. And that difference mattered, because it meant the choice ahead was not about leaving one thing for another. It was about recognizing where she stood within both. And across the city, Alexander Hayes moved through his day with a precision that had always defined him: meetings aligned, conversations structured, outcomes measured. But beneath that structure, there was a subtle difference. A pause that appeared before decisions, a space where he allowed information to settle before acting on it. And his team noticed it, not as a change in direction, but as a refinement, a deeper level of focus that made his questions more exact, his conclusions more deliberate. And yet, even within that controlled environment, there was a thought that remained unresolved, not distracting, not urgent, but present. The quiet awareness that something outside his usual framework had shifted his perspective in a way he could not fully map. And that awareness did not push him toward action, it held him in consideration. And back in the restaurant, Clara slipped the card back into her apron, not to hide it, but to carry it without weight, because the decision was no longer about whether she would respond, it was about how. And that distinction changed the nature of everything that followed. And as the afternoon moved into early evening, as the light outside softened and the restaurant began to fill again, Clara moved through her responsibilities with the same quiet precision. But there was a subtle difference in the way she held herself, not visible to anyone else, but present in the way she allowed her attention to extend beyond the immediate task, not as distraction, but as awareness of something larger. And when her shift finally slowed, when the rush eased into a quieter flow, she stepped outside for a moment, the air cooler now, carrying the distant hum of the city in a softer tone. And she stood there, not checking the time, not thinking through options in the way most people would, but simply allowing the moment to exist, and then, without hesitation, she reached into her pocket, pulled out the card, and dialed the number, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same calm intention that had defined every choice she had made since the beginning. And on the other end, in an office where the evening had begun to settle into a quieter rhythm, Alexander Hayes looked down at his phone as it rang, an unfamiliar number appearing on the screen, and for a second, he did not answer, not out of doubt, but because something in him recognized the timing, the alignment of a moment that had not been scheduled, had not been arranged, and yet carried a significance he could not ignore. And when he finally picked up, his voice was steady, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something quieter. "Alexander Hayes," he said, and on the other side, Clara did not speak immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that timing mattered. Even here, even now, and after a brief pause, she answered, her voice calm, clear, carrying none of the weight that most people would bring into a call like this. "You said I could choose differently," she said, and the simplicity of it held the entire moment in place, and Alexander did not interrupt, did not respond too quickly, because he understood now that the space between words was where meaning settled, and Clara continued, not explaining, not justifying, just stating what had already become clear. "I am calling to understand what that choice actually is," and the question, placed exactly where it needed to be, shifted everything, not into resolution, but into the beginning of something that neither of them would try to control too quickly, because for the first time, both of them were willing to let understanding lead before outcome. Alexander Hayes did not speak immediately after Clara Bennett's question settled into the line, not because he lacked an answer, but because for the first time, he understood that the answer could not be shaped the way he usually shaped outcomes. It had to be offered without pressure, without assumption. And that required a different kind of precision, one that did not rely on control, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, the quiet hum of his office surrounding him, city lights beginning to reflect against the glass behind him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, but without the sharp edge of negotiation. "It is not a position," he said, choosing his words carefully, "and it is not a contract." And Clara listened without interrupting, not because she agreed, but because she was measuring the space between what he said and what he meant. And he continued, not filling the silence, but respecting it. "It is access to conversations where understanding changes outcomes before they become problems." And the phrasing was deliberate, not persuasive, not embellished, just accurate. And Clara felt that immediately. Not the offer itself, but the way it was presented, because there was no attempt to define her role, no attempt to place her within a structure she had not chosen. And that was the difference. And she shifted her weight slightly where she stood outside the restaurant, the cool air grounding her in the moment. "Access usually comes with expectations," she replied, her tone calm, not challenging, just precise. And Alexander allowed a small pause, not defensive, not dismissive, simply acknowledging the truth in what she said. "It does," he answered. "But expectations are only a problem when they replace judgment." And that was the first time he had framed it that way, not just for her, but for himself. And Clara recognized that shift, not as a statement designed to convince, but as one that reflected something he had already begun to understand. And she did not respond immediately, not because she was uncertain, but because she was considering whether the structure he was describing allowed for the kind of autonomy she had chosen to protect. And after a moment, she spoke again, her voice steady. "And what happens when understanding leads to a different outcome than you expect?" And the question was placed carefully, not hypothetical, but grounded in experience. And Alexander did not hesitate this time, not because the answer was easy, but because it was clear. "Then the outcome changes," he said simply, and there was no emphasis, no condition attached, just a statement that stood on its own. And that simplicity carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have, because it suggested something rare, a willingness to allow results to shift based on insight rather than control. And Clara felt that, not as a guarantee, but as a possibility that had not been there before. And she looked out across the street, the movement of the city continuing in its steady rhythm, people passing by, without noticing the conversation that was quietly reshaping two separate paths. And for a moment, she said nothing, allowing the silence to settle again, not as hesitation, but as confirmation that the conversation had reached a point where words alone would not define the decision. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty it always had. "Then it is not access," she said. "It is responsibility." And Alexander did not correct her, did not reframe it. Because he understood that she had just defined the structure more clearly than he had, and he nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because acknowledgement did not require visibility. "Yes," he said quietly, and the agreement was not a concession, it was alignment, and Clara allowed that to settle, not as acceptance, not as rejection, but as a clear understanding of what stood in front of her. And she glanced back toward the restaurant behind her, the familiar space still waiting, unchanged, steady, and then forward again, towards something less defined, less certain, but no longer abstract. And she made a small shift, not in direction, but in intention. "I am not stepping back into what I left," she said, her voice even, "but I am willing to stand where it meets something new." And the statement did not ask for agreement. It set a boundary, and Alexander heard it exactly as it was meant, not as a limitation, but as a framework. And for the first time in the conversation, he allowed a small smile to form, not visible, not performative, just present, because he recognized something rare, not just intelligence, not just clarity, but the ability to define terms without needing to control the outcome. And that was where the real shift happened, not in the offer, not in the response, but in the understanding that followed, and neither of them rushed to conclude it, because this was no longer about reaching a decision. It was about recognizing that whatever came next would not follow the patterns either of them had relied on before. The line remained quiet for a moment after Clara Bennett's last words, not empty, not uncertain, but complete in a way that did not require immediate response, and Alexander Hayes understood that, not as a pause to fill, but as a space to respect. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something different, not authority, not persuasion, but clarity shaped by everything that had come before. "Then we build from there," he said simply, and there was no attempt to define what that meant beyond the moment. No structure forced into place, just a recognition that what stood between them was not an agreement, but an understanding, and Clara felt that settle with a quiet certainty, not because it answered every question, but because it did not need to, and she gave a small nod, even though he could not see it, because acknowledgement, like everything else between them, no longer required visibility to be real. And she ended the call without hesitation, not abruptly, not dramatically, just naturally, as if the conversation had reached exactly where it needed to. And for a moment, she remained where she was, standing just outside the restaurant, the evening air cooler now, carrying the steady rhythm of a city that never asked anyone to explain their choices. And she slipped the phone back into her pocket, the card no longer separate from her, no longer a question waiting to be answered, but a part of something that had already begun to take shape. And inside, the restaurant lights reflected softly against the windows, the same space she had chosen, the same rhythm she had protected, and she stepped back in without hesitation, not leaving one world for another, but carrying both with a quiet balance that did not need to be announced. And across the city, Alexander stood in his office, the phone still in his hand for a second longer than necessary, not because he was holding onto the call, but because he recognized what had just happened, not a negotiation, not a decision, but the beginning of something that did not follow the patterns he had relied on for years. And he set the phone down slowly, not rushing into the next task, not moving to control what came next, but allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. And the days that followed did not change everything at once. There were no sudden shifts, no dramatic transformations, just a series of quiet adjustments, conversations where listening came before response, decisions where understanding shaped direction rather than forcing it. And Clara remained where she had always been, but not in the same way. Her presence no longer defined by invisibility, but by intention, stepping in when it mattered, stepping back when it did not, carrying a clarity that did not need validation. And Alexander moved through his world with the same precision. But now it was guided by something deeper, a willingness to recognize what could not be controlled and to respect it instead. And somewhere between those two paths, something aligned, not as a fixed point, not as a destination, but as a shared understanding that did not require explanation. And that was where the real change lived, not in titles, not in roles, but in the quiet dignity of knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to simply stand where understanding meets something new. And if you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever held back what you knew because the moment was not right, then you understand that power does not always come from being seen. Sometimes it comes from choosing exactly when you will be heard. And if this story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar in a way you could not quite explain, then you are already part of it, just by recognizing it. And sometimes, that is where everything begins.